A full chapter straight to the end. The exciting story begins now. It's the 3rd year since my death. Liu Ryan is still trying to bring me back to life. But I've already returned to my original world. In my left hand, there's a cute little demon. In my right, a mature woman in black stockings. I've been living a carefree life. I thought I would never have any connection with her again. Till the day I was about to get married. The system malfunctioned. She crossed over from that world. She landed directly at the wedding venue, just in time to see me kissing the bride. At that moment, she went mad, smashing everything around her. In a hoarse voice, she begged me to go back with her. She almost fell to her knees. On the day Liu Ryan married her childhood sweetheart, the system announced my strategy had failed. As punishment, I was destined to face obliteration. But the expected death didn't come, because throughout this mission, I had suffered too much injustice and pain. The system granted me another chance. As long as I chose to end my life on the final day, I could return to my original world. The moment those words faded, I ran wildly to the highest point of the hotel. Looking down, I could still see the grand wedding scene. It was magnificent and vast, an endless display of luxury and glory. After all, he was the one she held closest to her heart. She wanted to give him the most precious and best of everything. As for me, the one who wandered with her everywhere, and the orphan who helped her rise again, naturally became useless. Thinking about all this, I started walking step by step toward the edge of the rooftop. There was really nothing left to hold on to. The wedding continued. Someone in the crowd was the first to look up, glancing in my direction. The sun quickly highlighted my figure. Who is that? Isn't that Boda? He's not going to jump, is he? These murmurs, one after another, quickly reached Liu Ryan's ears. She hesitated, then slowly turned around. The weather that day was particularly good. Not a single cloud in the sky. The bright light allowed me to see her expression clearly. Confusion, bewilderment, surprise. She seemed genuinely puzzled, as if she couldn't understand what I was doing, until half of my body was already over the edge. One of the company's assistants shouted, "President Liu, on a wedding day, how could someone be thinking of suicide?" At that moment, her entire body jolted violently, finally panicking. Liu Ryan stumbled as she rushed toward me. I had never seen her with such a terrified and fearful expression. She even tripped a few times, like a mad person who couldn't walk straight. Boda, what are you doing? If you dare to kill yourself, I'll take revenge on your whole family. Liu Ryan was clearly not thinking straight. She even forgot that I was an orphan with no parents or family. Who was there for her to take revenge on? And now that I'm back to reality, I can truly find my family. I flashed an incredibly bright smile. Liu Ryan shook her head. But Liu Ryan, what does this have to do with anyone else? It was you who drove me to my death. With that, I leapt, in front of everyone's eyes. At this grand wedding ceremony, I fell from the high hotel. Blood spread far beneath me. In my last glance before death, I saw Liu Ryan lose all her strength. She fell to her knees, crying her heart out. When I opened my eyes again, I was already back in my original world, surrounded by a quiet, white VIP room for one. Light was streaming down from above. The door creaked open. My mother walked in from the doorway. She saw me half sitting up against the headboard. For a moment, she was stunned. Then tears began to flow. She took two big strides toward me and hugged me tightly. "Dada, you've finally woken up. 3 months ago, I left the family company. Just as I stepped onto the street, a runaway bus came speeding around the corner. I couldn't react in time and was thrown into the air. The next moment, when I regained consciousness, I was bound to some strange traversal system. That system, it threw me into an unknown parallel universe, and it assigned me a task. As long as I could conquer the original protagonist, Liu Ryan, and become her husband, I could freely choose my future. I could return to my original world, not only heal my external injuries, but also receive an additional 80 million in rewards. Or if I chose, I could stay, live out the rest of my life with Liu Ryan in the book, and then return to my mother's side. Of course, if I failed the task, I would be erased, completely obliterated. To avoid such a tragic fate, I diligently pursued Liu Ryan. I shielded her from danger, took beatings for her. In the hardest times, I was the only one by her side. She once held me and swore that she would never betray me in this life. There was a moment when I even considered staying. But in the end, the truth was clear. I had been wrong all along. But it doesn't matter. Now everything is back to square one. We will probably never meet again. Because I didn't successfully complete the task, my body didn't heal immediately. In the first few days after returning, I stayed in the hospital, following the doctor's guidance for rehabilitation training. After about a week, I finally recovered almost completely. When I was discharged, many friends who grew up with me came. We were almost all from the suburbs. Most of them are famous second-generation rich kids, pampered and reckless, living without worries. To celebrate my recovery, they rented out an entire floor of the city's most luxurious hotel. They said they would party all night long, not stopping until everyone was drunk. I was nudged inside and found several young models already seated. Clearly, it was the handiwork of my wild friends, those carefree guys. As soon as they saw me enter, they immediately gave up the prime spot. Things quickly got lively. Someone poured me a drink. Another massaged my shoulders. Although I wasn't that interested in women, I didn't want to disappoint my friends. So I reluctantly drank a few glasses. I've never had a strong tolerance for alcohol, and soon I was feeling tipsy. In a haze, I vaguely heard a phone ringing. It was Shen Yuchu, my childhood friend and sweetheart, cold and stunning, with impressive abilities. She's already starting to take over the family business. I had just pressed the answer button when her delicate face appeared on the screen. The background seemed to be an airport. She was dressed in a professional suit, looking like a proper city white-collar worker. Seeing my flushed cheeks, Shen Yuchu quickly frowned. Her tone was icy. "You've been drinking again. Gee Boda, didn't you just get out of the hospital? Do you know how easily you get drunk? Who are those lousy friends around you?" I've always hated this side of her. Always acting superior since she's been better than me from a young age. Constantly putting on that mature demeanor. Always lecturing me. I raised my finger, just about to argue back with her, when suddenly my throat went dry. A sudden intense tearing sensation surged in my chest, making me feel dizzy. I could hardly see anything. I was back in that world again. But I couldn't speak or touch anything, floating aimlessly in a ghostly, soul-like form. The villa was just as it used to be, but it felt emptier and lonelier. I seemed to be in Liu Ryan's bedroom, and not far from me was her. In this world, just over a month had passed. She seemed much thinner, with faint dark circles under her eyes. She was crouched before a rectangular object, muttering something I couldn't make out. My curiosity got the better of me, so I slowly drifted closer, leaning down to look. In an instant, my whole being froze. It was a massive ice coffin, crafted exquisitely but icy cold, and my corpse lay right in the center, surrounded by herbs of some unknown kind, which seemed to prevent decay. At that moment, the body looked as if it had just recently died. With a faint smile and hint of mockery on its face, Liu Ryan reached out, gently tracing my cheek. From my eyes to the tip of my nose to the corner of my lips, being so close, I could finally hear the words she was whispering. "It's okay. Dada, you said you'd never leave me. Even if you're dead, I'll find a way to bring you back, alright? She's gone mad. I rubbed my forehead, looking at her in disbelief. Dead is dead. There's no coming back from that. Even if Liu Ryan is as wealthy as an empire, could she really change the natural order? But soon, I realized what she was doing. An assistant entered, bowing respectfully. President Liu, the time has come. The ritual on the sorcerer's side has ended. After a brief silence, Liu Ryan slowly stood up. A look of disappointment and loneliness flickered across her face, but she quickly masked it. Just as I thought, another charlatan. But it's all right. She pulled at the corner of her mouth, as if to comfort herself, tidying the disheveled hair on my corpse. Her movements were so tender and meticulous. It sent chills down my spine. I will find someone who can truly bring you back. After saying this, Liu Ryan strode out of the room. My soul, as if being dragged along, stumbled after her. It was only then that I truly understood what kind of person she had become after my death. Outside the living room on that vast, empty land were countless symbols and runes drawn chaotically beyond comprehension. On both sides stood prayer flags for summoning spirits. A sorcerer was positioned in the center, wearing a loose, white robe, holding talismans inscribed with strange patterns. Upon seeing Liu Ryan step out alone, the sorcerer's face instantly turned ashen. He seemed to realize that his attempt to summon a spirit had failed. Muttering, he shook his head. It shouldn't be this way. This is the summoning technique I learned from my master. Why didn't it work? I followed each step meticulously. It was supposed to have the power to resurrect. Unless he continued to mumble incoherently until Liu Ryan's patience seemed to run out. In the next moment, she suddenly drew a dagger and plunged it into the sorcerer's chest. Blood gushed out. I covered my mouth, screaming in silence, though I had always known that Liu Ryan had climbed to her position through sheer cold-bloodedness and ruthlessness. I never imagined she could be this cruel. The surroundings remained deathly silent. My furious curses, heard by no one but myself. Liu Ryan, expressionless, pulled the dagger out, wiping the blood off with a handkerchief. She spoke coldly. In 1 month, you took 100 billion as a reward, and yet you wasted a whole month of my time. If you can't do it, then you deserve to die. Countless talismans scattered, drifting and falling gently. Take the money and fulfill the task. The poor sorcerer probably never imagined that the newly crowned richest person would be so ruthless. He fell backward onto the ground. In his final moments, he suddenly seemed to have a flash of clarity. Blood spurted from his mouth, and he weakly muttered, "I understand now." Unless his soul doesn't belong to this world. That's why it can't return to the body. I began to grasp the truth. This sorcerer wasn't entirely useless. It was his magic that summoned my consciousness back. But as he died and the magic ended, my soul also began to fade. I saw Liu Ryan standing there with the dagger, staring blankly for a moment. She didn't seem to feel any particular emotion over the sorcerer's death. An assistant approached and asked how to handle the situation. She nodded slightly, then turned and walked back toward the villa. This time, I didn't follow. The surrounding sounds gradually faded. Everything became blurry and indistinct. Even I myself seemed to be sinking into the air, melting away. I don't know how much time passed. When I opened my eyes again, I had returned to the real world. My ears were ringing. It felt like someone was tugging at my face. It was my friend. He saw me wake up and let out a surprised shout, then stuttered in disbelief for a while. He finally managed to blurt out a sentence. "Boda, you scared the hell out of me. You were drinking just fine," and then suddenly collapsed. "No matter how much I called you, you wouldn't wake up. I almost thought I got you killed with those young models I brought in." The noise was overwhelming, but it made me laugh, to the point that tears streamed down my face. When I was in soul form, for a moment I truly thought I'd be stuck by Liu Ryan's side forever. I cupped his face and planted a kiss. Finally, I'm back. I scratched my nose. But explaining something like the whole system traversal stuff wasn't going to be easy. I decided to leave it for another time and switch topics for now. I glanced around and realized it was still the hospital room where I had just been discharged. Wow, how long has it been? Back in the hospital already. I coughed twice, grabbing my friend's arm. So, did you bring me here? I knew you were the best. How should I repay you? Maybe with my whole life? The room went silent for a moment. My friend lowered his eyes, staring at me. For a good 30 seconds, you collapsed like a rock. It was Shen Yuchu who helped carry you up here. Maybe you should consider marrying her instead. Just then, the hospital room door opened. Someone walked in. It was Yuchu. Around her right wrist was a string of brown prayer beads. She was wearing a black coat, looking both dignified and utterly exhausted. Behind her were 2 or 3 doctors in white coats, their faces anxious and hurried. It wasn't until they saw me, half covered by a blanket, reaching for the jelly on the nightstand, and playfully chatting with the person beside me, that her steps suddenly halted. Ji Boda. I heard her almost tremble as she said my name. Well, finally decided to wake up. To be honest, Shen Yuchu and I hadn't seen each other for a long time. I had been chasing Liu Ryan for 5 years. In the real world, about 2 years had passed. The time between the two worlds wasn't entirely in sync. I heard she had managed the company brilliantly, becoming quite a young legend in the industry. Unlike the rest of us idle second-generation rich kids, she had become something entirely different. Sure enough, when she entered, the atmosphere suddenly grew heavy. Feeling the awkward tension, my fearless friend decided to stir things up. He rubbed his chin, giving Shen Yuchu a sideways glance. Little Miss Shen, do you know what Dada just said? He said he wants to marry you. Damn it, I'm going to kill you. I jumped up from the bed in an instant, quickly covering my friend's mouth with my hand. I realized that even though my soul had been jumping between two worlds, my physical agility had recovered quite well. Don't you dare say nonsense. He hates me so much. We're sworn enemies. Everyone turned to look at Shen Yuchu. When she heard my words, she suddenly lifted her head, staring directly at me. After a moment, she stood up and walked out. Ji Boda, are you really that dense? Before my accident, what was my last encounter with Shen Yuchu like? It seemed we had a fight, probably over something incredibly trivial. I can't even remember the details. I was so angry I texted her to end our friendship. Do you really hate me that much? Let's never meet again. Her reply was a single word. We had fought since we were kids, so it wasn't surprising to me. But who could have known that just a few days later, she would go overseas for business, and I would end up in a car accident, only to be taken to another world by the system. Everything that happened after was what my friend and others told me. It was about 2 years ago, when Shen Yuchu was in Europe for a conference. She heard the news about my accident. At that time, a few old directors were giving boring presentations. Feeling a bit drowsy, she pulled out her phone to see if there were any good restaurants nearby. I've always loved food, especially as a peace offering after a fight. But just as she placed an order, a notification popped up in our shared group chat. Ji Boda had an accident. He's been in a car crash. It was said that his life or death was uncertain. Shen Yuchu took a private jet back overnight. She kept telling herself it would be alright. But when she finally reached the hospital, she was met with Ji Boda's parents. Both of them seemed to have aged significantly overnight, especially Ji Boda's father. once a decisive and formidable figure in the business world, now appeared utterly helpless. The doctor walked out of the operating room, removed his mask, and said indifferently, "There's no consciousness. Vital signs are stable, but he might end up as a vegetative patient." Shen Yachu sat in the hospital corridor the entire night, her mind in a daze. A vegetative state, she thought. But it's okay. Even if he has no consciousness, so what? Both the Shen and Ji families are top tier. I'll find enough doctors. I'll make sure he wakes up. For a time, she did manage to contact many renowned international surgeons and neurologists, but without exception, none succeeded. One highly esteemed elder scholar in the field, a top authority on the matter, bluntly told Shen Yachu, "In this case, there's nothing to be done. It's beyond medical explanation. Don't hold out any hope." That night, she locked herself in the study for hours. Outside, a heavy rain was pouring down. She thought, maybe it's time to let go. After all, every doctor said Ji Boder would never wake up. So she decided to plead with the gods instead. She would visit one shrine after another. Surely one of them would hear her plea. Rumor spread in the circle that she had gone mad. The once skeptical and rational young legend now seemed devoted to mysticism. Until one day, during a business trip, she passed by a rather remote village. A local guide accompanying one of the investors casually mentioned, "There's a peculiar temple here. It is said that its founder, thousands of years ago, was a sorcerer capable of resurrecting the dead. Quite a powerful figure. If someone in your family is ill, you might try praying here. It might just work." Shen Yachu decided to visit. It was located at the top of a mountain. The temple was small and looked rather shabby, mostly maintained by the local villagers. There was no proper transportation, only a long stone staircase, thousands of steps. When someone saw Shen Yachu approaching, they didn't show much surprise, just raised an eyebrow and asked, "Are you here to pray for a family member? What sect is this?" "We don't really know either, but it's known to be effective. If you're sincere, you should bow at each step, all 3,000 steps, and a summoner will descend." For the first time, Shen Yachu heard the term summoner, but she still in that dilapidated temple, knelt and climbed each step with reverence. An entire day and night passed. He was almost completely exhausted. He waited outside the Ling temple. Everything around was very. A breeze blew by, making the door creak noisily. Suddenly, something fell. It dropped from the shrine. It was a string of brown prayer beads. I remained silent for a long time. My brother, munching on sunflower seeds, chatted away. I heard that those prayer beads are a local specialty. Only those who pray sincerely can get them. He spoke with a gossipy tone. As expected, not long after Shen Yachu left from there. "You really did wake up." I hummed in acknowledgement. It wasn't because of the word soul summoner. I had heard of this profession in that world as well. To be honest, I was half believing and half doubting. After all, I had never truly seen with my own eyes such a thing as the dead coming back to life. What surprised me was, Shen Yachu, this person, had done so many things after my car accident. Helping to take care of my parents, managing several companies' businesses, searching for doctors, seeking help from specialists, even praying to gods and worshipping. This was so unlike him. I pinched my fingers. Suddenly, my heart felt a little sore, as if something heavy was pressing down on my chest, weighing down, heavy and oppressive. I grabbed my phone, opened the chat with Shen Yachu, swiped up. I could still scroll back to the time we argued and read that harsh sentence I had said. "Let's end it here. Don't ever meet again." I rubbed my eyes. My finger hovered over the chat box and paused there. Instinctively, I pressed the video call button. Before I could hang up, the call was already connected. Shen Yachu's voice came through. "What's up?" There was a moment when neither of us spoke. It was Shen Yuchu who broke the silence first. He said, "Jiboda, I never disliked you." I laughed. Me neither. We were both the type to say the opposite of what we felt. Growing up together, we got used to contradicting each other, so much so that neither of us had the courage to make the first move. My brother tugged at my arm from the side. "Since neither of you dislikes the other, why not give it a try?" Shen Yuchu and I started dating. This development was something both our families were happy to see. Our families had always been well matched, knowing each other inside out, especially during the time when I was unconscious. He was tirelessly running around, taking care of everything. My parents had long regarded Shen Yuchu as their son-in-law. In so many high society marriages, it's all about interests and connections. What Shen Yuchu and I had was actually quite a fortunate situation. Childhood friends, innocent companions. If nothing unexpected happened, we could probably get engaged within a year. During this time, I began to reintegrate into the high society circle, catching up on business knowledge I had missed, attending company meetings, joining gatherings with friends. Life was tightly scheduled, to the point where I gradually began to forget forced mission involving Liu Ryan. That humiliating and unbearable period. Until one evening, Shen Yuchu and I attended a business banquet together. He drove me home that night. When we reached the entrance of my villa, he didn't leave, suddenly coughing twice. Under the streetlight, the tips of his ears were slightly red. "Jiboda," he suddenly reached out and held my hand. Shen Yuchu said softly, "Jiboda, I like you. What about you?" But I couldn't quite hear him clearly, nor see him clearly. My ears were buzzing. Another voice interrupted. It sounded like Liu Ryan. He kept calling my name. "Jiboda, Ji Shinder. Are you really going to leave me here alone? Do you not want me anymore?" Liu Ryan had found another soul summoner. Time here seemed to pass faster than in the real world. It felt like over a year had gone by. This time, he had traveled to the western region, bringing back rare pearls and spirit herbs. He placed them inside the ice coffin. But even with these treasures to prevent decay, my body had already deteriorated beyond recognition. A faint smell of rot spread, filling the entire villa. I couldn't help but wonder, how could Liu Ryan endure this? Living, eating, and sleeping with a corpse. Just thinking about it made me want to vomit. Even the butler downstairs seemed unable to bear it, frequently coming up to persuade and beg. Word by word, he urged, "Please, bury him soon." Liu Ryan paid no heed. My soul lingered on. When I was inexplicably transported here, the group of company directors had just left. The villa finally fell silent. There was only a soul summoner dressed in white, and a lonely, noble lady, almost exactly the same as the last time. He held a talisman in his hand. On the ground were strange spells drawn with fresh blood. Although this soul summoner wasn't aware of my existence, with my previous experience, I quickly realized they were using a type of ritual, pulling my consciousness here. But this soul summoner was visibly more terrified and timid. His head hung low. His entire body was trembling. The collar of his clothes was soaked with cold sweat, especially when facing the legendary, ruthless, and decisive billionaire. Liu Ryan wiped the dagger against his sleeve with his right hand, while his other hand supported his aching forehead. His headache was intense. Another failure. Soul summoners are a rare profession to begin with. After piercing the previous one with a sword, he had spent great effort to find another one. But once again, it was in vain. Thinking of himself in this vast villa, enduring one cold, lonely night after another, the endless solitude almost consumed Liu Ryan. He instinctively pulled out the dagger, whispering my name. "Jiboda, are you really leaving me here alone? Do you not want me anymore?" Perhaps it was the sight of the dagger. The soul summoner truly panicked. He suddenly lunged forward, grabbing Liu Ryan's collar with his blood-stained fingers, his voice trembling, his words jumbled and incoherent. Mr. Liu, I really don't have the skills, but I know someone truly powerful. He's my master. Known as Master Qingying, he can bring the dead to life. Master Qingying was indeed a famous figure. Even I had heard of him, back when the Dragon Kingdom and the island nation were at war. To fend off the invaders, the defenders sealed the city gates tightly, allowing no one to enter or leave. With no food or water supply, many civilians starved to death inside. Later, it was said that Qingying passed by. He saw a child who had died, a tiny, emaciated baby, barely recognizable. He picked up the child. Not long after, the sound of crying was heard. That's how the tale of soul summoning began. Of course, it's just a legend. After that, aside from his students, few ever saw him again. Many said he had gone into seclusion. And now, this soul summoner, who was already terrified beyond reason, kneeled down, bowing forcefully. I know where my master lives. He will surely have a way. Liu Ryan set out that very night. I thought he was finally going to let go of that pitiful corpse. But instead, he ordered a truck to be prepared and still placed the dead body inside. This journey was not short. It led to a remote village, surrounded by mountains, on the highest peak at the center. My soul followed closely by his side, holding my nose, watching out of sheer boredom. I realized he seemed to treat that tattered corpse as some kind of emotional anchor. He would wash and tidy its hair to prevent further decay. He'd pull out freshly prepared herbs and pearls and place them beside the body. Liu Ryan seemed to suffer from severe insomnia, often unable to sleep at night. So he'd sit beside that lifeless body, recalling the experiences we once shared, over and over again, retelling them endlessly. Occasionally, he'd mention his childhood companion, but his expression would quickly darken. His tone became low and hesitant. I was just borrowing the power of his family. Don't take it to heart, Dada. I've already wiped out that entire clan. Soon you will be revived. When you return, no one will stand in my way. We'll start over. Won't that be good? Of course, it wasn't good. I rolled my eyes as hard as I could. But I was truly curious. Did that so-called old man who could bring the dead back to life really exist? If he was real, would he be like the system, summoning me back to this cursed place once again? These thoughts swirled in my mind. Anxiety and panic slowly spread, seeping into my heart bit by bit, to the point where, in the remaining time, I could hardly do anything at all. I just stared outside, watching the scenery recede endlessly. With Liu Ryan's boundless wealth, he, of course, didn't need to walk himself. He was carried all the way. Little by little, they brought him and my dead body to the mountain's peak. The legendary man who could connect life and death lived in a shabby little house. It was rather simple. Even hearing that the richest man had arrived, he didn't come out immediately. The soul summoner, who had narrowly escaped death, went inside to look for his teacher. Liu Ryan waited outside. An entire day and night passed. At last, there was movement inside. He was allowed to enter. An old man sat in the middle. He was thin and a bit aged. His eyelids lifted gently. For some reason, I felt for a brief moment that he looked directly at me. His voice was soft. I cannot help you. His soul does not belong here. Someone climbed 3,000 steps, kneeling with every step, just to wake him up. So I returned him to his rightful place. The air fell silent in an instant. Liu Ryan stood in that narrow, decrepit room, frozen for a moment. For an instant, I almost saw a look of despair on his face, as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff, confused and at a loss. He had no idea what to do next. He let out a furious roar. Liars, all of you are liars. What kind of master are you? What kind of magic If it weren't for you, there wouldn't be rumors of the dead coming back to life outside. I wouldn't have clung to such a faint hope for so long. The last sentence. He almost choked on his words as he spoke. He ordered the bodyguards to wait outside. In that small room, it was just him and Xing Ying. Of course, there was also my intangible soul. I saw Liu Ryan's eyes gradually turn red. He stared at the old man with a piercing gaze, as if trying to find a flaw in his words. You said you promised someone to send Dada back. There couldn't have been such a person. He's an orphan. He's been by my side all these years. Besides me, there's no way anyone would go to such great lengths to bring him back to life, he declared with certainty. Even if there was, who gave you the right to make that decision for him? Jiboda would never abandon me. To choose someone else. It didn't take long for me to realize who they were talking about. It was Shen Yuchu. I didn't know why. But this man named Xing Ying seemed indeed like a bridge, connecting the past and the future. He had a faint expression. Smiling slightly, his gaze fell on me once again. He raised his hand. On his wrist was a string of brown prayer beads, exactly the same as the one Shen Yuchu wore. He pointed at me, as if speaking directly to me. So who do you choose? Do you want to stay? The moment he spoke those words, a flood of images filled my mind. My father and mother, my friends, and the sight of Shen Yuchu kneeling on the stone streets. I shook my head vigorously, as if clutching at a lifeline. No, I want to go home. At that moment, it was as if Liu Ryan sensed something. He turned and looked in my direction, murmuring softly, "You're here, aren't you? Are you leaving?" He reached out his hand to me. "Are you going to leave me here alone?" But it was too late for him. The moment I uttered my desire to go home, a talisman drifted towards me. I heard the soul summoner's voice. "Go home, you won't be returning here again." I woke up in Shen Yuchu's embrace. He had placed me on the bed in the villa, wiping my forehead with a warm towel. Perhaps because he was already experienced. This time, when I woke up, I adapted quickly. He looked at me and seemed to notice something unusual. This time, he didn't call anyone else. Instead, he lowered his head. His lips parted slightly. "Jiboda, what exactly happened to you?" "The doctors said you were fine." This was something that had to be explained sooner or later. So I told Shen Yuchu, from beginning to end, how the system had taken me to another place entirely. And then I encountered Liu Ryan. I explained everything, including how I escaped through suicide and all that happened afterward. After listening, he remained silent at first. Then his expression gradually turned serious. For a moment, I felt a bit scared. Back then, to survive, I did everything necessary to complete the system's tasks. Would he hold it against me? But he didn't. He just gently held my shoulder and softly said, "I'm sorry. Jiboda, I never knew any of this. If I had been by your side back then, you wouldn't have had to suffer so much, right?" Tears suddenly poured down my face. During those days in the other world, shielding Liu Ryan from a blade, being falsely accused and abandoned by him, I never cried. Perhaps because I always knew he was cold by nature. So, I never dared to have too many expectations or emotions. But this time, I clung to Shen Yuchu's collar, burying myself in his embrace, allowing myself to cry and vent freely. I said, "Shen Yuchu, why did you come so late?" Shen Yuchu and I got our marriage certificate. I placed the red certificate and our matching rings together and posted it on my social media. That same night, the news spread through the high society circle. Our close friends insisted on gathering, demanding an all-night party before the wedding. Shen Yuchu couldn't resist them and had to agree, but he didn't expect them to go all out. They not only booked an entire venue, The top floor of a 5-star hotel. They even hired a live band and singer. The entire space was lively and chaotic. Shenyechu and I sat bored, watching everyone party wildly. The host of this pre-wedding gathering was a rich second-generation heir from a real estate company. Well-connected and popular. He was over there on his phone, calling his celebrity friends, asking them to come over and join the fun. Before he even hung up, a person who looked like a hotel staff member rushed up. He tapped on the wall and cautiously said, "Excuse me, did you also invite a cosplay performer?" The real estate heir raised his head, a bit puzzled. He had drunk quite a lot. His cheeks were slightly flushed. His reaction was a bit slow. "Cosplay?" He tilted his head, as if trying to recall. Maybe it was just a small, insignificant detail. No one paid much attention to it. I certainly didn't notice at all. After a whole day of activity, I was starting to feel drowsy. Shenyechu picked up his bag, draped a coat over my shoulders, lowered his head to look at me. Ready to go back, I yawned. Gripping his hand, I nodded. I thought no one would notice us leaving, but the moment we stood up, many people turned their gaze towards us. Someone started to cheer. "The bride and groom are leaving already? Kiss, kiss!" Stomped my foot in embarrassment. I gritted my teeth, glaring at the crowd. But Shenyechu, with his gentle nature, lifted my face with his hands, slowly lowered his head. His lips brushed softly against my cheek. Tender and intimate. My heart began to race. Just as I was about to hug him, someone called my name, G. Boater. Everyone turned to look towards the entrance. I squinted my eyes to see. Liu Ryan, covered almost entirely in blood, was wearing a bright yellow ceremonial robe. He looked strange and out of place in this timeline, and somewhat unbelievable. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Wow, a real cosplay. Who's that? What game character is he supposed to be?" But he's stunningly beautiful. Liu Ryan seemed oblivious to everything around him, as if he couldn't hear a thing. He only stared intently at me. His gaze locked on my hand, holding Shenyechu's. Blood dripped from his forehead, making his usually cold and calm face look slightly terrifying. He closed his eyes, then opened them again, clenching and unclenching his fists repeatedly, as if trying to suppress some violent emotion inside him. "Dada, I finally found you." He reached his hand out to me, his fingers trembling. "Come home with me. This time, I'll give you whatever you want, okay?" I had no idea how Liu Ryan suddenly appeared here, but he didn't seem surprised at all. "The Soul Summoner said you'd never come back, so I thought if you couldn't return, I'd come find you myself." When Liu Ryan extended his hand to me, I noticed the brown prayer beads on his wrist. He smiled, but it was a bitter smile. "So, I asked a powerful person for these prayer beads. After returning to the palace, I thought for a long time, maybe just like you, if I jumped off the rooftop, I could find you." I knew the person Liu Ryan referred to was Xing Ying. As for the prayer beads, they might truly connect these two worlds. But I stepped back, feeling as if he had gone completely mad. He had come from another realm without fear of the consequences. Was he really that desperate to die? Shenyechu turned to glance at me. "Dada," he said softly, "don't be afraid." I understood. He was recalling everything I had told him about the system and the crossing of worlds. He wrapped his arm around my shoulder, shielding me behind him. Word by word, he told Liu Ryan, "Dada has already died once. Do you think he'd still want to go back with you? He won't want you anymore." Those words were like a spark, igniting Liu Ryan in an instant. He became like a wild beast, full of aggression, suddenly lifting his head to glare at Shenyechu. Before that moment, he had only been looking at me without blinking, as if trying to hypnotize himself, desperately ignoring everyone and everything around me. But Shen Yuchu's words shattered his last glimmer of hope. Liu Ryan instinctively reached for his side, but there was no dagger there. It must have shattered long ago under the hotel. So he charged forward empty-handed. With red eyes, he shouted angrily, "What do you know? Do you have any idea how I've lived these past few years? I did everything to find him. I did so much to bring him back to life. There won't be anyone in this world who loves him like I do." The situation had completely spiraled out of control. The friends who had gathered around had sensed something was off long ago, but they didn't know the backstory. So they hesitated to intervene. Seeing Liu Ryan about to strike, they immediately swarmed over, gripping him tightly. Some even called security. With an aggressive stance, they threatened him. I don't know if you're dressed like this with ulterior motives, or if you're just plain crazy, but I warn you, all of us here are people of stature. Go ahead, ask around. There's not a single one of us you can afford to offend. Got it? Others chimed in with their own comments. I think he's just simply unstable. Is it because his family went bankrupt? Maybe he's lost his mind. Just give him some money to get rid of him. Liu Ryan was trapped in the middle. In that world, he had always been above everyone else. Even when he was on the run, there were still people like me who relentlessly pursued him. He probably had never endured such humiliation and contempt as today. I thought he would struggle and lash out, but he seemed to be in a daze. I followed his gaze and noticed he was staring directly at Shen Yuchu's wrist. The brown prayer beads there were exactly the same as his. He had always believed that Jiboda was an orphan, with no family, no friends, that he was the only one who cared for him in the world. Aside from him, who could he rely on? But at this moment, Liu Ryan suddenly remembered what Qing Ying had told him at the mountain temple, that he wasn't the only one who wanted to bring Jiboda back. He wasn't the only one waiting for him. He had always known Jiboda was a treasure, but now he would be cherished by someone else. After the security arrived, they escorted Liu Ryan away. One of them even kicked him in the rear. Fuming, he shouted, "Where do you think you're causing trouble? If we sold you, we still wouldn't cover the losses for tonight." We didn't pursue the hotel's liability further. After all, part of the reason was that I had created such a commotion. I truly treated him like something extraordinary. A strange sensation washed over me as I walked. Liu Ryan glanced back when he was leaving. He looked at me, opened his mouth, as if wanting to say something, but ultimately fell silent. I imagined he probably realized, after all the twists and turns, our relationship had come to a standstill. Shen Yuchu and I held our wedding a month later. Both our families loved a lively atmosphere. Plus, after years in business, we had quite a network in our circles. Therefore, the banquet was quite grand. Almost all the prominent figures in our circle attended. Wearing my wedding dress, I walked step by step towards Shen Yuchu. The sun shone particularly brightly that day. He smiled gently and reached out his hand. "Dada, I finally waited for you." In that moment, I truly felt that I had drawn a line separating myself from the dark, painful past, and I would never look back again, except for Liu Ryan, who crossed over through suicide. The only time I had seen him was that one time. I never heard any news about him afterward. I didn't know if he had returned to his original world, or if he had chosen to stay. Of course, it didn't matter to me how he was. In the second year after marrying Shen Yuchu, we welcomed a pair of twins, a son and a daughter. We named them Yuan Yuan and Man Man. A lifetime of happiness and completeness for us and our children. We truly made an effort to provide them with the best of everything. The only incident that surprised us was when they were 4 or 5 years old. The kindergarten organized a group activity. A few teachers took the students to a nearby park for a spring outing. The sister was led away by her brother. And quietly slipped away from the main group. They had no communication tools whatsoever. I couldn't find them anywhere. My hands trembled with anger. Shen Yachu was on a business trip. I rushed to the park in a frenzy. First, I ran to the broadcasting station. Then I saw the two kids sitting on the steps outside the broadcasting station, waiting for me, each holding an ice pop. They were happily licking away. My daughter seemed afraid I would be angry. She looked up at me with a smile. Dad isn't a bad guy. He gave us a very nice lady. We got lost and he brought us here. He told us to wait here. I was momentarily stunned, instinctively asking, "Where is he?" Dad should thank him. The two kids pointed back. Under the streetlight, from a distance. When Liu Ryan noticed me looking his way, he instinctively took a step back. He was now wearing a light blue uniform. He had become the most ordinary support staff in the park. No power, no money. By income standards, even food and shelter were issues for him. He turned his head away, as if realizing the vast chasm between us. He stumbled and slowly turned around. The two kids tilted their heads, curious. "Turns out that lady doesn't know you," one of them said. "He said I look a lot like you after I spoke your name." He was stunned for a long time. Then he cried. While he was crying, he asked me, "Dad, are you happy now?" I felt somewhat helpless, rubbing their heads gently. "And what did you say?" My son and daughter exchanged a glance.